Thank you for joining us today. This is a webinar to help you understand the Renters' Rights Bill, which will be presented to you, easy for me to say, by Roger Morris. So without further ado, Roger, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Natalie. The Renters' Rights Bill has now gone through both the Houses of Lords and the Houses of Parliament and will ultimately come fully into legislation through 2026 and 2027 due to the complexity of being able to implement everything that within the Renters' Rights Bill. What this webinar is intending to do today is to give you that high level of understanding, whether you are as a mortgage advisor explaining the implications of Renters' Rights Bill to a landlord on a purchase, remortgage or product transfer engagement with them, making sure that they are aware. To also, if you are a landlord yourself and you want to understand the implications and what the Renters' Rights Bill was set out to achieve, and also the opportunities of what extra products landlords should be made aware of, that I think as a landlord will certainly protect me and mitigate some of the key areas that seem to have raised the biggest emotion of feedback. It's very important in the world of buy-to-let to keep up to date with what is going on in Parliament, the House of Lords, and what is being debated. In 1989, Margaret Thatcher brought in a particular act, which was the 1988 Housing Act. At that particular time, tenants could remain in a property indefinitely. The right of eviction was not there. Tenants literally moved in and paid a rent. But what happens is the ability to increase rents wasn't there, and you would think that was a good thing, but it wasn't. It means landlords at the time were just not incentivized to improve the property. And we saw the quality of housing in the UK being at just about its lowest level. Margaret Thatcher's creation of the 1988 Housing Act brought into that legislation the creation of an assured short-hold tenancy for a period of 6 months, the ability for the landlord not only to regain the property, but also to increase rent. And at the immediate effect, there was a significant increase in the quality of housing within the UK, because it was beneficial for the landlord to constantly invest in the property and the ability to increase rent against market conditions. In my opinion, it's not since the creation of the 1988 Housing Act have we seen such a change when it comes to the private rental sector. So let's start to break down the Renters' Rights Bill in its key components. The paper is intended as practical and in plain English, the guide for mortgage advisors and landlords to explain the key elements of the Renters' Rights Bill, with particular focus on the abolition of Section 21, changes to eviction timeframes, and the move to periodic tenancies. So we're aware of the AST, the Assured Short-Hold Tenancy, and that will now be moved to an APT, an Assured Periodic Tenancy. But if there's one area of the bill that I think has created the biggest attention, is the abolition of Section 21, no-fault eviction. Landlords can no longer evict tenants without a valid legal reason, and this applies to both new and existing tenancies, giving renters more security. Let me put a balanced argument to this. If it was my daughter was moving and needed to get a house to rent from the private rental sector, and my grandson needed stable education and being able to go to a school where he could mix with friends and establish friendship and be able to remain in a safe environment, in a school and a location that was known to him and particularly my daughter. In other words, you want families to be able to put down roots and be able to plan long term. Having to keep moving children from school to school has a real negative effect on their education, particularly in certain areas of the UK where rental properties are very hard to come about. So being able to give tenants and families hardworking who maintain their rental payments on time some form of further security, I think is a good thing. We've seen a lot in the press where landlords will simply evict tenants just because market conditions have changed and they can get significantly higher rents. I think is not a good thing for our industry. Landlords should be in this industry for the long term. If a family decides to move out, and when renovating or taking the property back, they're able to remarket that property at much higher rents. There's nothing wrong in that. But literally to evict a family who've maintained their rental payments on time just for financial reasons, I personally wouldn't do that. And I don't think that's a good thing. That's my personal views, and they're not the views of Chetwood Bank. These are just my views as a landlord. So understanding the abolition of Section 21 and what it means in practice. Once Section 21 is abolished, which will be in 2026, landlords will no longer be able to regain possession of a property simply by serving notice at the end of a fixed term. Possession will only be possible by relying on one of the statutory grounds. So grounds will become a key part with this legislation, and there's different types of grounds, and it's set out in the legislation. These grounds include but are not limited to serious rent arrears, persistent late payment of rent, antisocial behaviour, and landlord's intention to sell or a landlord's intention to move into the property. Also, the grounds will cover student accommodation where 3 or more students are renting a property, and the landlord will be able to regain that property at the end of the academic year. There was concerns that students could remain in that property for an extra couple of weeks, meaning that the landlord wouldn't be able to successfully re-let that property for the next 12 months because they wouldn't have been able to guarantee that property and regain it. That's been covered off within this piece of legislation. So what is the current eviction timeframes when it comes to Section 21? Section 21 notice served a minimum 2 months notice. Court application after notice expires, typical 4 to 8 weeks, and a possession order granted, usually between 14 and 28 days, and bailiff's enforcement if required, which a lot of the times it is, a further 4 to 8 weeks. So in practice, a straightforward Section 21 eviction commonly takes between 4 and 6 months from notice being served to vacate possession, assuming no procedural errors. Now, let me be very clear on the procedural errors, which is why letting agents will become much more important. If at the outset of the tenancy, the correct documentation was not issued, things like giving the tenant a copy of the current gas certificate, an EPC certificate, if the tenancy was not the correct up-to-date tenancy, if everything was not done according to the rules, then this can be challenged in court and the actual eviction process thrown out, and the process has to start again. So I really do want to emphasize the importance and the need for correct documentation being issued right at the start of the tenancy. So the new eviction process and expected timeframes post reforms, when this actually becomes in law, following the abolition of Section 21, all evictions will be ground-based, while the government has indicated the court system will be reformed, though no details on that has been given, and digitised. The practical reality is that the eviction timeframes are expected to be longer than under Section 21. So this is becoming law. We don't know how the court process is going to be speeded up. What we do know is there's huge backlogging in the courts, which has been lots of different ways and approaches to how to reduce all the backlogs within the legal process, not just with the eviction process, with criminal court proceedings, etc. So let's have a look at the indicative timeframes under the new system once they are in force. Notice period, depending on grounds, with typical 2 to 4 months. In reality, what we're looking for is, I would expect a tenant to be in 3 months arrears before notices or the procedure to eviction can start. And then that can only be issued after they are 4 months in arrears. This is one of the key aspects that's been part of the Renters' Rights Bill. Court application and hearing commonly 8 to 16 weeks or longer. So it's 4 months before the full process can move, and then a further potential 16 weeks longer, and a possession order and enforcement a further 4 to 8 weeks. So 4 months before the eviction process can start, 16 weeks with the court application, and a further 8 weeks for enforcement. In total, advisors and landlords should be realistically expect eviction processes to take, in my opinion, 12 months. It says 6 to 12, but I would say 12 months, particularly when rent arrears are disputed or tenants contest possession. Now, what have I done as a landlord? Not to mitigate this, but as a proper business practice reason. You can get, and you should be speaking to your landlord about buildings insurance. There's specific product providers out there that do really good landlord insurance, where particularly where they've got portfolios, all their protection policies or insurance policies are all grouped together, which makes it far easier when claims go in. Secondly, a part of the buildings insurance, one of the associated products, apart from legal cover, which I definitely would take, is landlord's income protection insurance. The cost of it, I think, is quite small, 30 odd pounds for a typical policy. But what that means is, after the tenant is 1 month in arrears, the policy kicks in. It will then take over the eviction process, the court process, and the bailiff process. And I've used this on 3 or 4 times, and the product works exceptionally well. It's for the insurer to get the eviction, the arrears up to date, but they step in and take over the process. But you want to make sure that this landlord insurance protection doesn't just run 6 months. It should run the expected time frame of the current court process, which is, I would anticipate, 12 months. So hopefully that explains how Section 21 and that opportunity when engaging with landlords, talk to them about buildings insurance, and that you can then be responsible and put this together and built into that legal and landlord's income protection. Periodic tenancies. All tenancies will now be periodic from the outset. APT, assured periodic tenancy, replacing the AST, the assured short-hold tenancy. Replacing the fixed-term assured short-hold tenancy, this means there is no set end date and the tenancy will be automatically roll over on a monthly basis, giving greater flexibility at the end of the agreement. So what that means in practice, a tenant can move in, on day of moving in, issue the end of the tenancy and move out 8 weeks later. A landlord would need to have the tenant in for at least 12 months before they can consider notification of the tenant at the eviction or the requirement of the property back. This appears to give tenants much more flexibility, and where normally a tenancy agreement will be renewed every 6 or 12 months, this moves on to that periodic basis, and it gives tenants greater flexibility. But in all my experience, tenants do not just want to move properties very, very often. They have to therefore ensure that all their credit cards and bank statements and utilities and driving license and passports are registered at a particular address, and it certainly improves the credit score. So tenants tend to move into a property, and today where there's so much demand for rental properties, I don't find the transient moving from one property to another as it did, say, 10 years ago. AWAB's law was a very key component, and it actually didn't affect a property in the private rental sector. It was a property in social side of housing, and it was where there was a build-up of mildew and damp. And this is something that should be always taken seriously, that if a tenant is reporting the build-up of mildew, damp or mould, then it's very important to investigate quickly. This can be particularly relevant in Victorian properties where air brick ventilation has been masked over or sealed up. One of the negative consequences of increasing a property's EPC performance on a Victorian property from the current E to a C would be the absolute requirement of bricking up all air vents and therefore increasing mould and damp. And the only way to counter this is to have some form of proper ventilation extraction systems in every room of the house. This creates a lot of noise, a lot of extra electricity, and is very unpleasant. So one of the things under the new EPC SAP 11 review that comes out in 2026 in the summer will be how Victorian properties can effectively improve their energy efficiency and how to counter the need of ventilation. But any landlord dealing with damp or mould needs to take this very seriously, and it's one of the key part of the measures that came in the Renters' Rights Bill. Ban on rental war bidding. Landlords and letting agents must be set a fixed asking rent, and tenants cannot be asked to bid over the amount. This aims to prevent tenants from being forced to engage in competitive bidding for properties. When we had the Liz Truss big changes to interest rates and fixed rates on 5-year buy-to-lets had moved from 2.99 to 5.99 because of the big change in the logical resetting of Bank of England base rate, suddenly landlords who were having the need from a business point of view, because a buy-to-let ultimately is a business and needs to remain profitable, had to significantly increase rent. And also the demand and availability for buy-to-let properties creates a real problem. In my last buy-to-let that went on the market, I had well over 30 families trying to bid for that property. And it was not unusual for tenants to phone up and offer themselves to go above the asking price, the likelihood for them to secure the property. This will become against the law, and tenants will not be allowed to actually increase the bid above what has been set. And I think this is a key point. Because interest rates have now stabilised, I don't see this being an issue at all in the future. It was literally something that was caused with the redressing of interest rates that go back as far as 2007. Limited on rent increases. Rents can only be raised once a year, must reflect the market rate. Mid-tenancy rate hikes are no longer permitted. What this means is rents will be reviewed annually. Your letting agent, and I advocate more than ever, letting agents should manage your property now, because they will be responsible, particularly on fully managed properties, to ensure all the correct paperwork is set. And they will be able to accurately identify what is the correct amount of increases in rent. On a recent poll, statistically, most landlords over the last 10 years have not put rent up every single year. They've left it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, or even more sometimes if interest rates remain the same and not increasing the rent. What this will now do is really instigate and push landlords to increase rent every single year. And I think when we reflect back in 10 years' time, rents will have risen much higher than would have done without this piece of legislation coming in. Landlords now are required to increase your rents annually, because if they wait and take an average of rent increases, even though the tenant would say pay less over a 5-year period, landlords would need to increase rent annually to stop complaints happening. So ultimately, tenants will end up paying more rent, in my opinion. Certainly in my situations, I now put rents up every year. Previously, I didn't. Applications for decent home standard. For the first time, private landlords must ensure properties meet the decent home standards. This includes property maintenance and safety, with penalties up to £7,000 for non-compliance. I've always maintained my properties to a high standard and ensure that the tenants maintain the properties to a high standard. I would recommend that quarterly inspections of properties, detailed checking in and inventory checks, and photographic evidence of the property when it was originally handed over to the tenants, and then quarterly inspections to ensure that the tenant is made aware of where the property is not in the standard it was handed over, yes, like where for where will be accepted. However, it must be important that the property is kept to the highest standards. This to be able to maintain the highest possible rent. And secondly, it's important for both the landlord, the lender, to ensure the property remains at the highest standard, and the tenant, because it is their home. New possession for grounds. Landlords can repossess properties if they need to sell or move into themselves, but only after 12 months of tenancy, with 4 months notice required. So that means that they would need to be in the property for 12 months, then 4 months notice. So the moment the tenancy's been issued, it's 16 months before the landlord is able to regain that property. But I think that's fair. If you are renting a property out and you are aware that that property is there to provide a home for a family, being able to give some minimum assurances, I think is a great point. Now, the grounds become very specific, and the grounds are all detailed within the Act, and further information can be found on the website. Where there is a difference is if the property is a house of multiple occupation, and specifically in student accommodation. Student accommodation, the annual sort of term of when that property will need it be for that new academic year, and when that property is normally handed back, and the period of time normally where the landlord would go in and refurbish the property, those grounds are specific. And for 3 or more students renting the property, in effect, that period will be fixed for that 12 months. So student accommodation within the HMO market hasn't been affected by this. But if there's 1 or 2 students in a property, then the current rules, similar to the family AST or APT, remain affected for those 1 and 2 bedroom student accommodation. No blanket bans on benefits or recipients or families. Landlords can no longer refuse rent to tenants based on whether they receive benefits or have children, ensure fairer access to housing. Unfortunately, the average rent of a buy-to-let property in the UK now is £1,200, which is normally considerably higher than the local authorities' rental assistance for a privately rented buy-to-let property for a family that are on benefits. And therefore, unfortunately, unless it's certain parts of the UK, possibly the northeast of England, parts of Wales, where the property prices and rental costs are quite low, families, particularly in the south and the Midlands, would really struggle to potentially find a property if they are fully on benefits. These points become quite key. And the private rental sector database, a new database will be introduced to inform tenants about landlords' application and how councils enforce compliance. What you'll have is you'll have a database of good landlords, a database of bad landlords, a database of good tenants, and a database of bad tenants. I actually think landlords that have always operated a quality property and met and followed the rules have absolutely nothing to fear of this. But having a database of tenants, particularly tenants who have been evicted for antisocial behaviour and rent arrears, this will really accentuate that whole process. Unlawful eviction becomes a criminal offence, so it's important to be clear that unlawful eviction is already a criminal offence, and the Renters' Rights Bill just reinforces and strengthens the enforcement. Actions that may constitute an unlawful eviction include changing locks, removing doors or windows, cutting off utilities. Harassment intends to force a tenant to leave or attempting to bypass the court. So if you've got a tenant that's 2, 3, 4 months in arrears, regardless of your own personal situation, you cannot come in and take the law at your own hands. You cannot suddenly start changing locks, cutting off amenities, or failing to do the legal requirements like annual gas boiler checks. Even though the tenant's not facing, tenant is 4 months in arrears and eviction process is in, you still have to maintain the gas boiler and the regulatory checks. If you don't, it goes to court, or the property is not kept in a high quality of maintenance, then all this can affect your possessionary position. Landlords must therefore the key bits to learn from this. Landlords must place greater emphasis on tenant selection and affordability checks at the outset. Working with my letting agent and working with my insurance provider, who will provide landlords income insurance protection, the ensuring that the tenants have no county courts, no defaults, and that their income affordability will meet the current requirements set by the insurance provider. It's the insurance provider that will have the minimum standards. And if the landlord's income credit status does not meet their requirements, then unfortunately the tenancy will not proceed in their name. I've actually found in my experience as a specialist mortgage lender, it's actually easier to get a 95% adverse mortgage than it is to rent one of my properties. But this is so important with the new rules coming in, and it'll make it harder and harder for tenants that have got more than one income, non-provable income or poor provable income, or those with adverse credit. It's so important that landlords keep cash flow resilience and become more important due to longer evictions. So landlords need to build up more surplus funds to prevent any unexpected mortgage arrears. Again, this is why landlords insurance, income insurance becomes important. Accurate record keeping of rent arrears and tenant conduct will be critical to rely on in possession grounds to go into court. Again, a letting agent will really be able to help you with this. And landlords considering sale or personal occupation must plan well in advance. So if you are intending on moving back into the property, then certainly if that was expended within the next 12 months, don't rent that property out and think, well, after 6 months, you can put in possessory requirements, because you can't. Implication for mortgage advisors and lenders: greater focus on rental stress testing and portfolio resilience becomes important. But I actually don't see this having real effect, any ICR changes or lenders themselves. We just, as a lender, assume that landlords will make all the associate correct credit checks as they've done in the past. If anything, this is more of a maturing of the marketplace. My two key takeaways for you as mortgage advisors is upskill with landlord, buildings insurance. Look at those providers and find out who do landlord income protection insurance built in as a combined product. And the other key point is landlord's life insurance. If a landlord dies, they have no ability to sell the portfolio to repay the debt. It's the surviving spouse or family that will have to do this, as it could take up to 16 months for a landlord to take possession back to comply with their mortgage obligations. Having a large insurance, life assurance product put into trust, and in a limited company, this could be a tax deductible expense, makes absolute sense. I certainly have all my mortgages balance covered with my life assurance policy in trust. And I think this, backed with landlord's income protection, becomes two extra products that you should talk about to your landlords. It certainly makes sense to me. And remember, it's not the primary landlord that looks after the portfolio. It maybe should be their wife or husband, those that aren't lesser involved on a day-to-day basis. Hopefully that gives you a high-level overview of the Renters' Rights Bill. Some of these things, like the actual renters sector database and maintaining those minimum standards of a property, so the length of time a kitchen or a bathroom in, they might not ultimately take effect till 2027. But this is now in law, and it's starting to work its way through the private rental sector that I believe always has upheld the highest of standards. What the aim is to hopefully discourage and root out and have those bad landlords that have provided very poor accommodation, where tenants have gone in without having the experience of knowledge of not checking that the hot water system works, that the electrical system, which should have certificate with it, or the property's in very poor condition, not having the finances or the knowledge to take the landlords to court, have simply walked away from a tenancy, but ended up being pursued successfully by that bad landlord through the courts. This will now give renters the right protections that I think they needed. And I think overall it's well balanced for the private rental sector. So back to you, Natalie.
Wow, thank you, Roger, for taking us through those key components. I think there's a lot to absorb there, but hopefully you've taken a lot from this session. So Roger will be hosting live webinars around this in the future, so look out for those on social media. But I think for now, thank you for watching. Take care, and we hope to see you soon.